to this edition of Real World Business Law, where we talk about real-world issues impacting businesses and executives. My name is Nick Johnson. I'm a partner here at Berenzweig Leonard. Joining us virtually today, we have a very special guest, Pavlo Phididis. Pavlo, thanks so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation, Nick.
Pavlo, you are the founder and CEO of Oric, which is a corporate growth company focused on advising privately held companies. Tell us a little bit more about your business before we kind of get into the topic of the day.
Look, what inspired the establishment of Oric, it's a 16, 17-year-old business. We work now with around 3,500 established medium-sized businesses on 5 different continents. And what informed it, what inspired it, Nick, was this idea that we are, when we start businesses, really good at building revenue in order to generate income. Let's call that the operator mindset. However, 95% of businesses started fail to sell, they close. And that final payday, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years into the future, eludes by far most of us. And what Oric does is it closes that gap. It works with a founder, an owner, its team in a business to scale and grow, but increasingly and importantly, to double down, deepen, and secure value for the end game.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for that, Pavlo. And just as some background, while we're here today on another episode of Real World Business Law, this is a special episode that we're doing in collaboration with our BL Ignite platform. BL Ignite is a platform here at our firm focused specifically on advising startups and emerging growth companies through the everyday challenges of growth. And so it's great to be with you and working with you kind of on the businesses that you focus on, because it's directly in line with what we do here at BL Ignite. So Pavlo, the issue that we're talking about today is what I view as one of the first and most critically important questions that business owners and founders need to really think about critically and ask themselves. And that's how to properly form their business and really how to get their business right from the start. And so, Pavlo, it might be helpful just to kind of kick us off. I mean, in your own words, with some opening remarks, tell us, based on your experience working with your clients, why it's so important to get these issues right from the start. Why is it important for business owners to be thinking about properly forming their business, before they've even, got a contract, before they even have a revenue stream? Why is it important to be thinking about these issues?
Well, Nick, I think you need to be really clear around why you're doing what you're doing when you start a business. By far, the majority of people who do start businesses do so more out of necessity rather than opportunity, despite the fact that we read widely around taking advantage of opportunities. But by far, most people start out of necessity. They've struggled to find reliable work in the corporate world of employment. They've struggled to find revenue through other sources. The establishment of a business is a good way to go. And typically you build it on the back of a skill, a capability, a talent, an interest that you have. But the reason behind the business has very little to do with the products that you make and sell or the services that you design and offer. The reason a business will thrive and exist and sustain and grow is if it defines clearly who it is you serve, what problem you solve, and define your business on the back of that market and the problem you specifically solve and how you solve it and for what value you solve it before you yourself believe that it is the features or attributes of the product or service. So be clear on what it is that makes a business work. Not you, not your products, not your services, but the proposition that we are a business that exists to solve problems for a well-defined market. The second comment I would make is understand this. The Excel spreadsheet you have provided yourself with, that you're using as your hope and dream of what the business can become, will absolutely not manifest. It will never become a reality. Things take 2, 3, 4 times longer and 2, 3, 4 times the cost that you ever envisaged. And for that reason, it's going to take time to get from where you are to where you want to be. typically 7, 10, 15, 30, 40 years, whatever the case may be. And at that point in time, Nick, you need to be able to exit the business for a significant premium capital gain in order to secure a return for the last 10, 15, 20 years of investment, of sacrifice, of uncertainty, of heartache that it's taken to build the business to that value. If you don't incorporate cleanly, clearly, and carefully, and you don't have that as the endpoint in mind, you will simply start tomorrow with a view that you will be able to make it right down the line, and seldom is that the case. Hence the 95% of companies that start that fail to sell. In fact, they close.
Well said, well said. And I like the idea of kind of being intentional and thinking about, thinking about your sale, even before you start, running the business. And I think you mentioned incorporating. I think that's one of the most important issues to think about when you are forming this business is, okay, I have this idea, I have this market that I want to tap into. What type of entity do I form? And we have a lot of clients that come to us with this great idea. And one of the first things that we talk to our clients about is, okay, what type of entity makes the most sense for your business? And it's not cookie cutter. I mean, there are various types of entities that you can choose from. Sole proprietorships, LLCs, so limited liability companies, partnerships, or corporations. I would say of those, the most commonly utilized and what we find ourselves working with our clients on are forming limited liability companies and corporations. There are unique advantages to either one, and a lot of it may be industry specific. But when we're talking about limited liabilities and corporations, which is what we're primarily going to be talking about today, one of the main advantages of incorporating or forming and organizing as an LLC is it helps protect your personal assets. That is probably the number one reason why it makes sense to either incorporate or organize as an LLC. If you don't otherwise form as a company, your personal assets could be exposed. There are also some tax advantages to incorporating either as a corporation or forming as an LLC, but certainly protecting your personal assets is one of the most important factors of that. I think, once we determine the type of entity that you want to form, another question to ask yourself is, where should I incorporate? Where should I form? A lot of companies, they form in Delaware. They form there because Delaware, it's very pro-business. It has a very pro-business court system. And from an investor standpoint, that is viewed very favorably. Virginia is great too. And it's actually, the process of forming a company is relatively straightforward. It's all done through the Virginia State Corporation Commission. But I think in terms of, where you form, you need to think about asking yourself, okay, where will I also be operating? Because you may find yourself in a situation where perhaps it makes sense to form outside of the state that you're transacting business. But if you do that, you still need to remember you need to register in the state where you're doing business. Couple other just differences between LLCs and corporations that I think are good to know. When we're talking about an LLC, it is owned by members. Corporations, on the other hand, owned by shareholders and generally governed by a board of directors. When we're talking about an LLC, the governing documents that are going to govern how that business runs is typically going to be through what's called an operating agreement. And Pavlo, I know we've got some case studies that we're going to be talking about later on, which highlight the importance of having a strong operating agreement. But just wanted to touch on that with an LLC first. And so, you've got an operating agreement with an LLC. With a corporation, on the other hand, unlike an operating agreement, you're going to have a shareholders agreement and bylaws. And that's going to kind of spell out voting and how the corporation will run. But those are some of the key differences between an LLC and a corporation. But Pavlo, why don't we kind of get into some of those case studies that we were talking about? And I know you've worked with a number of clients who probably come to you with some horror stories about how they probably wish that they would have come to you sooner, or come to BL Ignite. Give us some examples of why in real life it's so important to be thinking about these ownership issues from the start, rather than waiting to the point where you're considering investors, rather than waiting until the point where you're considering a potential sale. Why does it make sense from a real world perspective to think about this? And maybe we could talk about some of those case studies.
Nick, it's something that comes up almost in every engagement that we have with every business that we work with. So if I think of the most recent example, just yesterday, I met with the client that's in a fairly new industry. It's in the functional mushroom or CBD industry. They're 7 years established. And what they do is develop and distribute through various retail channels all these premium quality, high strength CBD products and functional mushroom supplements. 16 people employed, a nice, heady, healthy $7.2 million annual revenue. But here's the thing. It is a market that has changed significantly. It has a novelty element to it, a fad element to it. So product development and new channel development are key features in how you build out that business. And each and every time, the founder and the current CEO and leader of that business wants to make a pivot in strategy, he has to contend with 39 shareholders, of which 3 are located outside in other countries that have significant, or meaningful rather, control over the business itself. He has lost completely the ability to be agile and to be adaptive in response to, or to create market opportunities. And it's now stalling that very attractive growth that he has enjoyed in the last 2-3 years. Had he structured the business differently, and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on it, around how you keep flexibility and agility when incorporating through either the LLC or the corporation structures that are available.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we regularly talk to our clients about is, I think, having key stakeholders involved in the business is obviously critical, but maybe not everyone would be an equity owner. And so there's equity alternatives that you can provide to some of those key stakeholders, so that you're not dealing with a situation like your client was dealing with, where every time you make a decision, you need to get votes from 29 or 39 people. That can certainly stall things. Another alternative is, perhaps different classes of shares. You can have voting and non-voting shares. And so, particularly, maybe you want to have it set up so that, the founders receive Class A shares, and that, the later on investors or other key employees, receive Class B shares, yet they're non-voting. So that, in other words, when it comes time to make a corporate decision that requires a vote, that you're really only dealing with a much smaller subset of Class A shareholders. That's one potential strategy. Or and alternatively, if it's an LLC, I think an equity alternative may be something to consider, where rather than giving them actual ownership in a company, which when you receive actual ownership in a company, the default rules are, you are an owner. You generally would get voting rights unless either your operating agreement or your shareholder agreement says differently. You also get audit inspection rights. Almost every state in the country allows owners of a business to have access to the books and records of a company. And so, perhaps rather than giving them actual equity, you can provide them with some equity alternative that allows them to participate in the growth of the company and potentially in the sale of the company without all of the strings that come with being an owner and voting. And so there's many different strategies that you can consider. And I would say, maybe multiple classes or even equity alternatives would be a way to think about that.
And Nick, I think it's especially important in industries that are changing quickly, and that in order to grow, you would have to be agile and adaptive, for the simple fact that very often in those environments, you're going to be going through a number of different phases of raising capital. And each time you do, here's a concern I often get, Nick, from a founder owner. I used to own my business. I now am a minority shareholder. I run, drive, grow the business, and yet what's in it for me? And this issue of dilution becomes a pretty significant inhibitor emotionally and psychologically to the commitment and growth efforts of the key driver, which is typically the founder. What are your thoughts on how you prevent that dilution, or how you secure a reasonable, meaningful stake in a business despite having to raise different rounds of funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting a strong operating agreement or shareholders agreement in place early on is just so critical. And let's just talk about just operating agreements for an LLC. I mean, I would say some of the key things that you want to have in an operating agreement. Of course, you're going to want to have the full legal name, the registered agent, it's registered principal place of business. I think you're going to want to talk about, okay, the management of the company. Is this going to be managed by the members? Is it going to be member managed, where the actual owners are the ones managing the day-to-day? Or is it going to be manager managed? Are you going to appoint a manager who will be running the business? Voting, we talked about that a little bit before. Is it one for one? Each unit is one vote. That's pretty standard. Or is there going to be some alternative? I think, laying out, what happens when certain unfortunate events happen. I think you need to spell it out. I think, what do you do if a member dies? What do you do if a member becomes disabled? What do you do if a member wants to resign? I mean, when we talk about death and disability, a lot of companies have those funded through insurance, either through Keyman or buy sell. That's one thing to think about. But also, what do you do when an owner says, you know what, I'm done, I'm ready to retire, and perhaps they want to transfer their interest. I think spelling those out early on, preferably, get the assistance of an attorney, someone, who's kind of familiar with this, to help you think through these issues. But spelling that out early on through an operating agreement is key. I mean, the operating agreement is going to spell out how you allocate profits and losses. It's going to spell out, ownership percentages. It's going to spell out if there are capital contributions, who contributed what. It's really going to be the contract between the owners that lays out, hey, here's how we expect this business to run. And if there ever is a dispute, knock on wood, hopefully it doesn't happen, but I can tell you as a litigator, it happens time and time again. But if there is a dispute, that operating agreement is going to be the first document that you look to resolve those disputes. And so really being intentional. We talked about that at the very beginning, thinking this through, thinking about a potential sale when you're forming. I think you need those same concepts apply when you're putting together an operating agreement.
It's honestly, I wish we had spoken about this already in July. I met up with the client that we're working with. They have been going great guns. There were two founders. They do digital development, so they provide software as a service for the financial services, health, energy industry. They develop really smart digital products. 98 employees, 17 years established, $19 million of revenue. And Nick, this is how and why it comes from nowhere. The one founder in the weekend before was at a barbecue with some friends. And they were having a discussion about life and lifestyle and business and, as one does. On Monday morning, he walks into the business and says to his co-founder of 17 years, hey, listen, buddy, I'm going to start prioritizing my health and well-being and lifestyle over and above this 5-day work week, 6-day work week, 10 hours a day, because that's what it's taken to build a business to where it is. And my mates were telling me, in fact, that they're moving towards 3-4-day weeks. They're going to let the heavy lifting be done by the team. And I'm going to be moving in that direction. And here's the thing. The dispute arose out of the following. They're both shareholders, the founding shareholders of these businesses. But what they never did, Nick, is they didn't qualify in the operating agreement what earns the shares. In other words, if I'm on the tech development side, the product delivery side, what are my requirements, my obligations to earn 50% of the equity of the business? If you're on the front end of the business, responsible for market development, at what point have you earned your 50% of the equity? At the same time, we will both be working in the business, and that shareholders agreement or operating agreement does not suffice as an employment agreement, which means we as employees alongside shareholders in the business have a different set of obligations. And I think if you don't get those agreements right, the point you made earlier, it becomes very, very difficult to resolve disputes in a fashion that does not harm the value you have built in the business.
And Pablo, I think it's a very interesting, real life case study. I mean, I think in that scenario too, I mean, in addition to the issues that you just flagged, okay, let's just say you have a founder who leaves, and how do you determine the value for that ownership? I mean, absent something in the operating agreements providing for a valuation, whether it's fair market value or some alternative, you're really left to the default rules of the state, or that's where disputes arise. And so I think thinking about those issues of, okay, what happens if one of my founders elects to retire, or worse, what happens if he or she elects to leave and go start a competing company? Do I want to put in certain restrictions in my operating agreement to make it clear that, hey, in exchange for receiving this equity, I'm going to limit, where you can go, or limit what information you can use if you were to leave this company and go form a competitor? And so, it's quite common in these operating agreements, in shareholders agreements, to have certain restrictive covenants that apply to the owners, so that you're not found in a situation where you have one owner that leaves and starts a competing company. But then also, I think spelling out, okay, when someone leaves, is no longer associated with the company, whether it's through, again, death, disability, voluntary resignation, or something else, how do we value that ownership? And spelling it out at the very beginning is certainly something that we recommend. And unfortunately, we see problems arise when they don't do that. Pablo, I think we're coming to the end, and I think you and I could spend a lot of time here today talking about some war stories and case studies on some real life examples, but we're limited in time. I think as one final question that I have, and I would be kind of curious to get your take on this. I mean, working with startups, working with emerging growth companies for as long as you have with your company, what would you say is one of the toughest decisions that an early stage business owner needs to make?
Oh, my word, Nick. You know what? I love them or hate them. The single most important thing to scaling and growing are the people you employ. And the very first few people that you employ are going to come at a significant cost. There's a cost in understanding mindset differences. There's a cost in understanding capability. There's the cost of affording the right talent at the right time to do the right thing. And very often, I see a lot of disappointments emerging around how you make a decision to employ, who you employ, and how you structure those employment agreements. A good entrepreneur will guard the downside and open the upside. And good employment agreements are seldom found in early stage businesses around that big, significant investment you make. The first 5, 10, 15 people that you employ.
I think that's incredibly well said, and actually maybe a great teaser for another episode that we may want to get on the books, because employment agreements and memorializing that early on is of utmost importance. And so unfortunately, Pablo, we are out of time today, but this was a great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciated you coming in studio.
Fantastic, and I look forward to taking it to its next level.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us for this latest edition of Real World Business Law.